today and for our conversation on federal policy landscape and what it means for the future of climate transition. I'm Joe Curtatone, president of the Alliance for Climate Transition. Before I took on this role over 3 years ago, I served as mayor of Somerville, Massachusetts for nearly 2 decades, where we led bold efforts on climate action, transit expansion, and equity-centered urban policy. Today, though, through ACT, I work with climate economy leaders across the Northeast region to advance a just and resilient and affordable energy future. And it's no secret that we're in a pivotal moment for clean energy and climate policy in the United States. Over the past few years, we've seen historic investments through the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. But more recently, we've also seen signs of retrenchment through executive orders, proposed budget cuts, and trade actions that are sending mixed messages and signals to the market and creating uncertainty for states and communities. Today, we'll hear directly from our panel of federal experts on where things stand and where they're headed, on everything from fiscal policy to regulatory authority. Specifically, we'll dig into budget reconciliation and rescissions and their implications for clean energy programs, the outlook for fiscal year 2026 appropriations and climate-related funding streams, the economic and policy ripple effects of new tariffs on clean energy, and the impact of recent executive actions, including orders to curb state-level authority over national energy infrastructure. Now, all of this raises significant questions for states, many of which have built their own clean energy and climate agendas on the assumption of federal partnership and funding support. So how do we move forward in this evolving policy landscape? We're fortunate to be joined by a panel of experts from Tremont Strategies Group, who bring deep experience across federal and state policy, public affairs, and strategic advocacy. And I'm going to be asking them to briefly introduce themselves and share what they're seeing right now in terms of federal policy dynamics and their impact on the energy and climate sectors. For everybody who's joined us today, I'm going to ask you to please post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get back to them during the question and answer session following the discussion. First, I'm going to introduce George Gomes and ask George, let's start with you. Can you kick us off with a quick intro and tell us what's catching, this is a loaded question, by the way, what's catching your attention most in DC right now?
That was definitely my reaction to that question as well. Mayor Curtatone, and thank you so much for the invite, and thanks to ACT for sponsoring this today. So my name's George Gomes. I'm Vice President for Research and Policy at Tremont Strategies Group, working mainly on federal affairs with a couple of my colleagues who will introduce themselves in just a few minutes. In terms of DC, what's catching my eye personally, I think you mentioned the word uncertainty in your introduction, and it's certainly an uncertain time for federal policy across many different areas. We're going to talk a lot about those areas later. Upheaval and confusion seem like the words of the day, and that's not only coming from the Trump administration, but also from some of the actions that are being considered in Congress. And so, there's just a lot of that uncertainty, and uncertainty in all sorts of industries, but in clean energy in particular, because of the infrastructure implications, the long time periods that you have to sort of plan things ahead have real implications on being able to secure this energy transition that so many of us are hoping for. So this uncertainty, this inability to sort of accurately predict what's going to come, we're going to do our best today, but no one has a crystal ball that is creating significant problems in clean energy and in other sectors as well.
Well, thanks, George, for that. Lisa Shan, over to you. I want to hand off the same question. What trends or shifts are you paying close attention to as you advise clients in this space?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. And I just want to echo George's thanks in having TSG here today. I'm Liesl Sheehan. I'm one of the partners at Trauma Strategies Group and run our federal practice. I spend most of my time working on congressional initiatives, so that's certainly what I'm tracking very closely. We have spent the first couple months of this year and this administration living through a lot of pain in terms of sudden and unpredictable cuts that have been coming primarily from the Trump administration pretty much overnight. It has been a real roller coaster for people in clean energy and across many sectors, as George referenced, trying to understand what the cuts are, what they mean, when they would take effect, what the injunctions are that are coming from the courts saying that funding should be unfrozen, and will that actually happen or not? I think, one of the things that we're tracking in particular is agricultural policy, because a lot of cuts supporting the farming industry were some of the first ones to take effect, but they were also some of the first ones that courts said the Trump administration needed to unfreeze. There are also some of the grants and tax credits, et cetera, that the Republican states tend to care most about and are going to be most vocal about with the Trump administration in pushing back on them. So we are tracking that closely because that's a little bit ahead of some of these other cuts and court orders to see what's coming from or what the results are from those cuts and then from those court injunctions, and where the administration is unfreezing funds and where they're not unfreezing funds. And then we're certainly tracking where Congress seems to be accepting and supportive of cuts, something like the workforce reductions, but then where the Republican Congress seems to be very hesitant to accept funds and feels like they need to put money back in place. So they, for example, are talking about an agricultural package right now that could boost some of the kind of more farm-led states, and the same could be true of clean energy and the way they shift it. So those are some of the initiatives that we're really tracking. We're also waiting for the president's budget request, which is typically sent to Congress the second Tuesday of February. It is, for a lot of obvious reasons, very late this year, and we're expecting that in about 6 weeks, probably that last week of May, though some of the budget documents are starting to leak a little bit this week. That's going to show a lot of the restructure in federal agencies that the Trump administration is proposing, and it's going to show what they're intending to make permanent as a cut versus what they're trying to restructure and just fund differently. So that's something we're going to be waiting with bated breath for, to kind of see what the future of the federal government and federal spending looks like.
Thanks, Lisa. And finally, Dan Collins. Dan, you bring a unique lens given your experience in both federal and state policy. And what are you seeing in terms of federal state dynamic right now?
Well, first of all, thanks, Joe, for having us, and thank you to everyone who's joined. It is great to be here. The federal state dynamic, it's fair to say, is an uneasy one, and I don't think that's a surprise to many who are tuning in today. Each state is reacting to federal actions in its own way, but it's fair to say that the states in the Northeast in particular are operating in an environment of uncertainty and concern. But focusing on Massachusetts for the moment, because that's where I do the bulk of my work, the Commonwealth is grappling with everything from a federal pause on offshore wind leasing and permitting to the meaning and effect of certain executive orders, the potential impact of tariffs on things like solar components and materials for construction of larger energy infrastructure projects, funding streams that would normally support investment in clean energy projects and state programs, and that sort of thing. And so, we've heard officials in Massachusetts say just being able to reach a federal agency, normally a partner and a resource, can be difficult. They wonder sometimes if is someone literally going to answer the phone when they call, amid federal agency reorganization and layoffs and the like. But despite these challenges, states like Massachusetts are projecting resolve to press ahead. And regionally, the states have been, leaders in clean energy. I don't have to tell folks that. They know very well that a lot has been accomplished here over the many years. And that there's still things that the states can do on an individual basis under their existing authority, albeit with some limitations and with some uncertainty, again, using that word. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that I'm thinking about. One is the recent act that requires a procurement of 5,000 megawatts of mid and long duration energy storage by 2030. I know the state is targeting, I think, 1,500 megawatts by the end of July this year. That's something that, again, there could be effects given what's going on with the federal government at the moment, but it is something that is largely in control, that the state is in control of setting those procurements and enabling that policy. Another one is like building heating. That's an area where we've made some real inroads, and so incentives for things like the purchase of heat pumps or local, and state zoning rules that can help guide electrification. That's again something that I think the states can move forward on, but always the caveat that there may be overlaps where there's some dependence on federal funding or federal permitting. Um, and I guess the point is that the states are trying to be nimble rather than overreact. And they are building in some flexibility, knowing that we are in this dynamic environment. So caution, but remaining focused on the policies and goals at hand.
Great. Thanks, Dan, and thank you all for that intro. Right now, we're going to dive into some key themes and questions together. But let me just say up front that for the panelists, feel free to jump in and respond to each other. This is meant to be a dynamic conversation. And let me just once again state to all our attendees, welcome. And inevitably, you'll have some questions. And if you do have a question, please post those in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Post those in the Q&A box. And at the end of the conversation, we'll take some questions during that period. So to kick off our discussion, to Lisa, let me start up there. If you can give us a high-level overview of where things stand with budget reconciliation and rescissions, and what's at risk for climate-related programs and incentives that were funded under the IRA or other recent packages.
Sure. Happy to, Joe. So right now, Congress is in a 2-week recess. And just prior to that, at the end of last week, I'm sure everybody saw that the House passed the Senate amended budget resolution for the reconciliation process. Reconciliation it's a very confusing process. It's something that is not done too often. Obviously, the last time it was done was when we got IRA, but you need to have both chambers of the Congress as well as the White House all in the same party because you only get to do one a year, one per budget year. And it is used in particular because in the Senate, you only need 50 votes instead of the 60 that you usually need to get over a filibuster threshold. So that's where, when Trump was in office the first time, we saw budget tax cuts take place. When President Biden came in, we saw the IRA pass, and now we're back to the tax cuts. The bill that the House is currently working off of right now, and I should back up, the resolution basically just sets the framework that allows committees to go in and draft the actual reconciliation bill. So I think we've had a lot of people ask us why they can't find the text for the bill yet, and that's because it hasn't actually been written and released yet. So the resolution that was passed through both chambers requires significant cuts, in particular, 880 billion through the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. That will include a lot of healthcare, but also energy related measures. The IRA funding is definitely at risk. A lot of that, of course, has been frozen already, but there's IRA funding at risk there. That IRA funding will be at risk moving forward in appropriations as well. And anything else that's kind of in clean energy that is not an authorized program is going to be at risk through either reconciliation or the appropriations process moving forward. But at this point, we're expecting Congress to move very quickly on the reconciliation bill. The House will be out again next week, but the committees are still working on drafting the bills. Our understanding is actually several of the bills have been drafted and sent over to the Congressional Budget Office for a CBO score, which is what they need to start moving forward on this. And then when they come back the week of April 28th, they're going to start marking up these bills. T&I, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, has scheduled theirs for, I believe, April 30th. Energy and Commerce just set theirs for the following week. I think it's May 5th. And we're expecting Ways and Means to set, which is kind of the big ultimate markup because that's the tax markup. That will be set soon after. Speaker Johnson's then hoping to get all these subcommittees to mark up their bills those 2 weeks and get the full bill to the House floor the week of May 12th and then bring it over to the Senate. He's hoping for the following week. You could see that slip by about a week, but right now the other complicating factor there is that we are about to hit our budget, our debt ceiling limit. And when we do, we will be out of extraordinary measures. So Congress is under a real extreme time crunch to try and get this reconciliation package through because they're planning to add a measure that raises the debt ceiling for the next 2 years to the reconciliation package. We initially were hearing between June 30th and August 30th for this date that we'd hit the debt ceiling, but now it sounds like Congress is hearing from Treasury that that could be closer to early June, which means they're essentially working against a Memorial Day deadline to get reconciliation through Congress and over to President Trump for his signature. So it's all kind of behind the scenes work that's happening for the next 10 days or so. Once Congress comes back, it's going to become much more public and it's going to be a very frantic couple of weeks trying to get this bill passed. That will be the first set of real cuts that take place across the board. The other thing that we're expecting to have happen as soon as Congress comes back is President Trump is going to send a rescissions package over to Congress. This is something that in state government, I think in Massachusetts, like this happens with some regularity. That doesn't happen too often on the federal level. President Trump tried to do it before, wasn't successful at it. So it's pretty unusual. However, Republicans in Congress this year have been asking for a rescissions package to make permanent some of the cuts that Elon Musk and Doge have put forward. It's kind of, we think this is happening because it's a legal protection, right? To make sure that these are formal cuts and that they can build next year's appropriations package off of those formal cuts. This is where programs that are not authorized are going to really start to come into jeopardy because if there's no authorization, no legal statute that's protecting that program, and we work on plenty of climate programs that unfortunately fall into that category, they're at risk because it's much easier for Congress to cut that funding because it's not mandated funding at that point. So those are, I think, the timelines we're looking at. From there, we will move back, as I referenced, to the appropriations process where we see where money is starting to go. That's going to allow people to advocate for where they, programs that they want to see funded across the country. And that's where it's really going to become important for people to start voicing their opinions with their delegations on what should be funded moving forward.
Thanks, Lisa. So given that backdrop and the procedural processes there in the fiscal part, George, from your perspective, George, what's most likely to be preserved or rolled back? They can speak to it.
Sure. I think, a lot of the IRA is at risk, as Liesl mentioned. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is ideology, but the other is math. And it's the math that the Congress has kind of written themselves into with the budget resolution. So Liesl mentioned the $880 billion that the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House has to find according to their budget resolution reconciliation instructions. They can do that through healthcare. There's obviously like a big threat to Medicaid that's happening. There's also substantial energy funding that was put through the IRA, through that committee. The bulk, I would say, doesn't go through there. It goes through the tax committee, which is Ways and Means in the House. And those would be things like, most of the energy generation credits, EV tax credits, things like that. Those are also at risk, unfortunately, because they have set themselves a $4.5 trillion tax spend, essentially. And that is going to encompass extending the Trump tax cuts. But the wish list in terms of tax policies that they'd like to pursue is actually far above that, probably closer to $5.5 trillion. So you have that $1 trillion gap that they need to come up with additional savings for. So even as you're essentially spending money through that committee by foregoing federal revenue, there's still the need to raise some other taxes in order to do further cuts, if that makes sense. And I appreciate the math's a little confusing there. So that's led people to believe that a lot of the IRA tax credits are in danger just from a simple arithmetic sort of standpoint. We have seen the beginnings of pushback on a lot of the clean energy generation tax credits, because those have been disproportionately in more rural Republican areas in red states. Essentially, the benefits have been felt there in manufacturing, and sort of the knock-on effects on subcontractors, dispersed industrial benefits, and certainly in terms of the president's understood desire to bring to onshore manufacturing. This is already starting to happen to an extent through the IRA. And so there has been, a group of Republicans who are in Congress who are starting to advocate for keeping at least some of those tax credits in place. I think Liesl had just sort of started talking about the importance of starting to advocate for priorities. And I think that is an area where, to the extent that folks on this call, even though you might be in the Northeast, you might be in a blue state, if you have contacts, if you have suppliers, if you're a business, if you have allies who are in some of those red districts, red states that do have, sort of economic livelihoods that are depending on these tax credits, that can be a really powerful motivator for some of these members. So certainly a lot of threats coming mainly at this point through the reconciliation package. The rescissions that Liesl mentioned have been more targeted at the foreign aid side. Those are at least the ones that have been signaled. But certainly, there's the potential for further rescissions to come out this summer. But in terms of the big picture threats right now, it's really a lot of those kind of legacy defining pieces of the IRA that are at risk at the moment.
And let me take that, and based on what you just said, George, and Lisa, will come back to you as we're looking ahead, a little more conversation on the fiscal year 26 appropriations, given the fact that it's just been alluded to. We know the predominant of the IRA benefits went to red congressional states and districts. For example, on manufacturing alone, I believe it was 10 billion versus 180 outside of those districts. And it's real. And there are all signs there is a small but vocal group of Republicans advocating for a more surgical approach. So given that, Lisa, what are the key climate and energy provisions currently in play, maybe within the IRA or outside? And where are we expecting major cuts, and what programs are most vulnerable?
Yeah, George may have a little bit more nuanced answer on this as well, but I really think actually all of them are at risk. I think, there are certain ones that are higher risk, like EVs. There's just not a lot of support for EVs or EV infrastructure in the administration, but also on the Hill right now. But then you look at some of the kind of more advanced clean energy initiatives, and those do have congressional support in a way that other programs don't. So there's going to be a broad look at IRA in general. I think EVs and wind are the biggest targets of this administration and the Congress right now, though.
And go ahead, George. Yeah.
Sorry, Joe. I think a lot of the other, they are environmental policies, but not necessarily energy policies. So like there was a huge investment in weatherization of houses, right? Improving climate resiliency, these kind of things that were included in the IRA. Those unfortunately do not have that sort of saving grace of having that disproportionate impact in Republican states. You could argue certainly resiliency with like the state of Florida existing, but it doesn't seem to, have that same constituency. So I would say those ones are definitely at risk. And the other thing, getting back to my math, which I apologize for making everyone do math this morning, but a lot of those policies are also in the Energy and Commerce Committee. So they are looking to hit that $880 billion number.
Oh, great. George, we also seen, as everyone knows, a number of new proposed tariffs that will impact clean energy technologies, including solar and EVs and battery components. And how do these tariffs square with the domestic clean energy targets, and how are they expected to affect deployment timelines?
they don't square with the targets, unfortunately. I think most people on this call who, spend any time, looking at this industry know where the supply chains are, and as good a job as we've started to do at onshoring some of this stuff, there's just a lot of it that you cannot, feasibly manufacture domestically at the moment, or, at least we're not far enough down that road. I would say just, without talking about a specific country or a specific tariff, obviously the Chinese tariff war that seems we're not going to abate that anytime soon. But there was this huge announcement of reciprocal tariffs that was almost immediately backed off from, and now we have this minimum 10% sort of global tariff. The uncertainty, and there's that word again. The uncertainty is the real danger here. For any business, but particularly, as I mentioned earlier, for infrastructure heavy, long-term investment sort of industries like clean energy, like environmental, like this entire environmental movement that's trying to make decades-long transitions. If you don't have certainty in federal policy, and that means not only funding, tax policy, trade policy, I know we're going to talk later about regulatory policy, right? If we don't have certainty in these things, then you can't make these investments that we need to make the transition, right? It's just it can't happen in a sort of orderly way. So it's a huge risk.
Thanks, George.
So
Jan, let me go ahead.
Real quick, to
Yeah.
build on the tariffs, I think as we're talking about the engaging red states and Republican members and subcontractors and everything like that. The tariffs were a very interesting case study where I think we all saw that that was really what started to break Washington. And the first time we saw Republican senators in particular stand up to President Trump and say, this is going to be disastrous for my state or my district. That goes back to advocating, getting the entire supply chain and partners all over the country, right, to advocate for what are the tax cuts that are important, what are the grants that are important, and how do we make sure that that stabilizes the economy in this member's district or state moving forward. There was a report that came out just this morning that's all over the Hill that talks about how more IRA money is actually spent in Republican districts and states than Democratic districts and states, and getting people to raise their voice and understand why that's important. I mean, I'll give you an example. We're working on a clean energy project that a lot of the research on manufacturing, the project's based here in Massachusetts, but most of the research and manufacturing was actually being done in South Carolina. When we brought that to Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott, they had no idea that any of this was coming out of South Carolina, and they really started to change their tune on supporting it. So, I think the tariffs were a really good case study for all of us in understanding why and how you will get members that President Trump and his team will listen to weigh in on issues that are really important for your projects.
And that reminds me of a question that was on hold at the end, but I want to ask it now. Then I want to get to Dan on the states. But and I've heard this story. In many states, they might use a different verbiage. But when you're talking about landing jobs and placing and enhancing the manufacturing and new technologies, especially state governors and leaders, even those congressional districts are fully supportive. So what should advocates, businesses, and clean energy leaders be watching most closely over the next several months? And where are the decision points that advocates should be engaged? We touched on them here, and how should they target their approach to the DC? Back to you, Lisa, Linda, and George.
It's a great question, Joe, and I think that this is really the time to be vocalizing that, because the members of Congress are putting together their appropriations requests right now. We're going to probably see June that the House is going to mark up their appropriations bills. The administration is putting together, what matters to them and where they're going to be funding things in agencies and reorganizing agencies moving forward. Right now, we just saw kind of the Department of Education release their first potential org chart, so we're going to start seeing that other places as well, and making sure that members who are part of your entire project, so subcontractors, research done at universities, national labs, the whole think through the whole chain and make sure that they are all writing about what they support, or having conversations with members about what they support and what makes a difference in their district, right? Or 200 people at a factory in the district that are working on manufacturing on your project in Tennessee, right? That's going to matter to Chuck Fleischman, who's the chair of the House Energy Appropriations Subcommittee. So those are really critical conversations to have right now because I think the Republicans in Congress are being very strategic on where they're weighing in with the White House for their priorities. And so making sure that your voice is heard through members that you might not traditionally work with is going to be really critical.
Great. Let me get over to Dan. Thanks. Dan, let's talk about the executive order aimed at protecting American energy infrastructure and curbing perceived overreach by states. Please help us understand what's the intended scope of this executive order and what authority does it invoke to limit state level decision making?
So good questions. It's an executive order on its face that is aimed at state energy and climate policies that it claims violate federal law and undermine what it calls America's energy dominance. And I read that, just myself, personal opinion, as perhaps being a preference for certain kinds of resources and technologies versus others. And so it's very broad and essentially directs the Attorney General to identify and review state laws that address things like climate change, environmental, social, and governance policies, and environmental justice, those three specifically. And then the AG must then take enforcement action against these laws should she find that any violate federal law. Now, notably, this EO is particularly focused on state regional cap and trade mechanisms and the so-called climate superfund laws but we've seen in Vermont and New York recently. And there's some important caveats here that I should point out. So first is that the California cap and trade rule, which is a specific target of this executive order, has already held up to numerous legal challenges in federal court. So there's that sort of practical matter right there. And the second is that the executive order doesn't attempt to make new law. In fact, it just directs the AG to recommend legislation to affect the executive order's intent, which is essentially acknowledging that in many, if not most cases, congressional action would be needed to actually, do anything with regard to these state policies. So from a practical perspective, also, I'd say that the legal challenges are going to likely delay the full implementation of this executive order. We've seen things in the past sort of mired in litigation. I would expect the same with something as sweeping and as at the same time targeted as this one is, with so many advocates, particularly in the states, pushing back. In addition, this does appear to be more of a similar kind of political message than anything else. Although I think we should all take it seriously. I'm not suggesting that it's something to just dismiss. I'm more thinking, that, at the end of the day, the states have a long history now of taking, legal action, meaning, like legally authorized actions to control or rather to set policies around energy and environmental policy. And they've enjoyed quite a bit of autonomy in that regard. And I'd like to think that, over the years, there have been plenty of legal tests to challenge the contours of state authority. And so I am just personally somewhat optimistic that this won't have the sort of upheaval effect, if you will, that maybe it looks like on the surface. But again, we need to take these things seriously and just and then see what the states do in reaction.
Yeah, and if you're going to talk a little bit more, Dan, about what you're seeing in terms of how states are preparing for a potential shift in resources, especially in terms of implementation, and are you seeing any contingency strategies underway?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting. And again, I look through the lens mostly of Massachusetts, just because, again, that's where I sort of do more of my work. But, we can start with the state budget, for example. We look at Massachusetts. Just yesterday, the House released its proposed budget for FY 2026. And it's a relatively modest budget that I think reflects the times that we're in. And in fact, the House leadership has said, that they're trying to create a kind of a backstop to what they call federal chaos. And so I think it's really the name of the game there is stability, and some measure of predictability, in the midst of all of this sort of rapid and unpredictable change coming from the federal government. Um, I would note, though, that the budget does propose a 7% increase for the Office of the Attorney General, which, signals, and again, that the House leadership has confirmed this, that that they see the Attorney General being quite busy with litigation, perhaps pushing back on a lot of federal actions that they deem just either violative or just intolerable in terms of Massachusetts law and policy. And in another one too that I thought was really interesting just this week was the announcement by the Healy administration that there's this Massachusetts Tariff Response and Business Operations Support Initiative. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's an initiative led by the Mass Technology Collaborative to respond to federal tariffs and their impacts, specifically on Massachusetts-based businesses. And I think the idea here is to kind of create a network of resources and that can lead businesses to these sort of alternative supply chains when tariffs, create burdens. That the usual sort of avenues that they might use are kind of held up. It's unclear to me at the moment, like how effective this will be. It is, after all, a program within one state, and when you're talking about international trade, this may help somewhat, for certain targeted uses, but just unclear as to how broadly it would help. Um, but otherwise, again, the states are going to lean into what they can control, whether it's energy and climate policy within the confines of their authority, budgeting, and then just enforcement of state law.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to go right to the Q&A from the audience and remind everyone, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box. And at the end of today's webinar, afterwards, we'll send an email out to all attendees, including the contact information for our panelists. But let me just stay on the topic of states and for everyone here. Here's a question from the Q&A part. As governance is moving to the states, is anyone tracking what's happening with interstate compacts on shared resources? Example given, rivers, aquifers, especially with neighboring states with different political leanings.
I'm sure somebody is. That's not something we're tracking comprehensively, but I do think, returning to that question that Dan got about the executive order, the federal government is definitely signaling that they're going to, try to take a much, I guess, more strident role in sort of interstate policy and in the management of shared resources, and that's a really similar issue to what you're describing in this question about interstate river compacts. It does not appear to have been a direct target yet, but they're kind of working their way down their checklist, so I wouldn't rule it out in the future. The other thing is, the involvement of federal agencies, as we were kind of talking about, has been really significantly hampered. And I think, Dan, you were mentioning, who do we call at the Department of Energy right now? Is there anybody at home? And I think those impacts are being felt across a range of different agencies, including agencies that play a role in some of these interstate agreements. So it's definitely, it's an unusual situation in which the federal government is in court arguing for an expansive federal role while simultaneously sort of shirking that role in terms of the day-to-day management of these resources. And I don't know that anybody has a great answer to it yet.
Yeah, that's another question, Kim. When will we see, I think we're seeing it right now, what will the impact be for the layoff of government employees? It's always been mentioned, I've heard this, you can't get some folks to answer the phone. And I'm sure you would all agree on that.
In terms of the effectiveness of the federal government, it's being felt across the board already. When that, we've seen them get a little too close on various things, right? We fired the nuclear inspectors and then had to hire them back. We fired some FDA drug inspectors and had to try to hire them back, right? there are inevitably maybe not 5 alarm fires that are sort of simmering, and I don't know exactly what that first emergency that sort of comes to the front is. It looks like Liesel might have a thought too.
I just was going to jump in there too, Dan, because I know there was a question on this. I think we're going to see those effects. It takes time. It takes, 3 or 6 months for those things to kind of flesh out. So I think we're going to see them probably in Q3 and Q4. As it took a long time to even figure out who was fired, right? Like they didn't, HHS didn't do their layoffs until a couple of weeks ago. So, and at the same time, people are being called back to the offices and they don't have a physical office or a phone line to work in. So there's just kind of like mass confusion at the federal government, and that's going to cause a problem in addition to the layoffs. That is going to eventually come together in this perfect storm with the frozen funds and then these court injunctions that are back and forth on everything from the IRA grants, right, to IDCs, and what's going on there. So, I do think we're hearing kind of like the White House start to pay more attention to where they can find support for something like the IDCs, the indirect costs on some of these grants, and is there like a set level that they can that's maybe a little bit higher that they can address. So this is probably all something that like around Q3 we're going to see start to hit more. But to George's point on the fire, um, part of the reason this debt ceiling deadline was moved up from June 30th to early June is because we laid off half of the IRS workforce, and then tax collections fell by 10% this year. So, we are about to start feeling the impact of these workforce reductions. And I think we'll see some of that in the spring and summer, but I think by the fall is when we'll probably start really feeling that impact.
A couple of questions specifically related to the investment tax credit and pro tax credit. So I'm going to combine these two, if it's okay. The one, well, one just came off, but is HR 2838 sponsored by Rep. Fedorchak a real threat to phase out the ITC and PDC?
I think the bigger danger is probably the reconciliation bill, just for the sort of arithmetic reasons we were talking about, right? There are ideological reasons why Republicans are opposed to some of these policies, but if you can use them to further some other policies, it's a lot easier to get people who might be a little bit more ambivalent about it on board. So I think the chances of any standalone legislation passing are relatively low anyway, right? You're much more likely to get things in a package, and knowing that they're already, potentially on the chopping block going into these reconciliation negotiations, that's by far the bigger threat, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think, and we all want you all to handicap what's going to happen is difficult at this point now. But we're on that question as well as people, folks attending others, and our ecosystem asking them is if the IRA GOP actual hold steady
Yeah.
to hold the tax credit programs, to not allow them to cut back, or which bonus investment tax credit categories, if anything, are more in danger of being lost.
And Joe, I would add, like, let's not remember Republicans like tax credits, right? And so some of this is going to morph, right? There's there's a lot of negative stuff that's going on right now. There will be some positive opportunities as we move forward and as we look at, as we get past this reconciliation package and look at opportunities that exist. The same process happened when the IRA was coming together, right? It started as Build Back Better, and we had to kind of like scale it down. And then once Democrats kind of got through that process, we were able to work to other opportunities here. The research tax credit, right, manufacturing tax credits, these have been popular among Republicans for a long time. So some of these tax credits may go away but come back in a different form. And that's again where weighing in on what's important, I think, is going to be really critical here, because Republicans do want tax credits and they want to incent job growth moving forward. If we see things like tariffs stick, they're going to have to incent some of these, some of these tax credits moving forward. And there's this interesting thing happening with the child tax credit right now, where that was for a long time a Democratic led tax credit that was, that really took off during the pandemic when Democrats were able to include that in all the packages that were kind of coming together really quickly as COVID hit. Um, for many, many years now, Democrats have been trying to extend that because that expired. So they wanted to bring it back and extend it. And Republicans have been opposed to it for a long time. In fact, it's part of the reason that we didn't get a tax credit package through last year. But this year, Republicans have been taking charge on bringing the child tax credit through. That's child tax credit is really what's driving the conversation on potentially putting a new tax bracket in for the wealthiest Americans to offset writing the child tax credit. So there's this unique conversation that's developing on tax credits and where they can be used to actually help some of the things that Republicans are out there talking about they want to do. So there's interest in tax credits, and I think the thing for people to remember is that in its current shape and form, a lot of this will go away, but there's going to be investment opportunities moving forward. There are going to be tax credits moving forward and helping shape that. And this goes back to the conversation on having all of your partners in all of the states across the country vocalize those things that are most important and what's going to help grow a business, create jobs moving forward. That's a really critical part as this starts to morph.
Let's talk about that in terms of the tax credit and on the investment side. One of the successes of the IRA was to alleviate risk for investment in early stage companies, and that was big. And as with all the success of those established companies in the climate economy, there's so much more to come if we dare to do it. So this is for everyone. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. So, but which industries do you, on the federal side, foresee climate tech ventures from seed to Series D facing the biggest challenges or negative impact from federal policy, and any potential opportunities such as geothermal or thermal or nuclear? And then Dan, we come to you, ask, what state governments, Mass, New York, California, others are the ones to watch for offering the strongest policy support to climate tech ventures, again, seed to Series D. I'll let you guys have that.
It's a big question. Honestly, I think we need to see how the next few months sort of play out in terms of where the tax policy is, right? Because that's going to make a huge difference in terms of viability of a lot of these things. We do see fairly strong bipartisan support for nuclear. Nuclear has always had trouble kind of getting over the finish line because of the huge costs that are associated with it. That's certainly a route for Republicans to say they're for clean, sustainable energy without, you can argue depending on your ideological background there. I know, we do some work in fusion and we think that fusion has a great future, but that's obviously also highly dependent on what the federal regulatory and funding landscape is over the next couple of years. And, we spent a lot of time working on that and I couldn't tell you what's going to, what the situation is going to be like in a few months, unfortunately.
Yeah. Right. Dan, if you want to talk in the States, we certainly have a lot to talk about here in New England, but who's supporting the ecosystem?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the positives for states like Massachusetts, California, New York is that, we're not new at this. We've been at, sort of early stage development of clean tech and there's a really strong sort of public-private ecosystem here. And so I think that, again, companies, investors, et cetera, can really lean into that ecosystem to some degree, even as we're sort of weathering the changes that are occurring, that are emanating from DC. But just to stop for a moment in Massachusetts, again, it's just a more familiar territory for me, you've got the Mass Leads, Act, all that investment and the Mass Clean Energy Center, things like that I think bode well for the future, for the sort of, development of some of these technologies, some of these solutions. And yeah, things like geothermal are showing more promise. I think we're going to just get better at that, start figuring out some solutions around that, around fusion, around some other technologies that maybe we haven't even considered quite yet. So, maybe that's a bit of optimism. I'm not always known for my optimism, but on this one, I'll throw it out there for the record. And just note that, yeah, I mean, I think, again, we're well positioned here in Massachusetts, unlike some other states that maybe aren't thinking quite, so far ahead.
Yeah, I'll echo the optimism, but it has to be determined. You know, we kicked off our accelerated clean tech open Northeast Greentown Labs a couple of weeks ago, and the amount of say commitment and enthusiasm and commitment still in the room was tremendous. And I just came back, and I think, you know, and I go back to what you all have advised us to put an economic lens, you know, impact on, you know, job creation, revenue creation locally. And it's something I advise our ecosystem members all the time. Why these tax investments or federal policies, what they're doing to result in jobs in manufacturing and affiliated industry benefits, whether it's metal fabrication, skilled workforce, or shipbuilding, you know. And we should talk a little bit about offshore wind, given some of the federal action recently announced in the last couple of days. But I do have some more questions. I want to spend the last 8 minutes making sure we get to as many as we can. There is a specific question on the House Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. And as simple as, is it a safe bet that that caucus won't come back? Is the smaller bipartisan caucus still operating? Are there unofficial bipartisan activities happening without being called a caucus? Because language and verbiage does matter, and any constraints on deciding whether they call themselves a caucus or not. I think I can guess who asked that question. I like it though.
I am happy to jump in here. As far as I know, the caucus still exists. Caucuses go through phases, though, where they are more, regardless of what the topic is, where they're more active and less active. I'm sure that they're not necessarily having productive meetings at the moment. I would expect it to be a place that members can maybe convene on some of these issues that we've been talking about, these opportunities we've been talking about, right, moving forward. So I do think Washington as a whole has gone through this. I've been kind of calling it like a corporate restructure over the last couple of months, right? Where we've gone through all these cuts, both in personnel and in funding, and we will build out from here. And whether that's grants or tax cuts or, you know, appropriations, whatever these next steps are, we will build from there. And so people are going to have to come together to pass some of these things. Let's not forget that reconciliation is the only measure that can go through Congress that doesn't need bipartisan support, because while the House needs the simple majority, you need Democratic support to get anything through the Senate right now. There's only 53 Republicans. So you have to have at least, and there's one Republican that generally does not vote with their caucus. So you have to have at least 7 Democrats that are voting with Republicans, oftentimes 8. So I think the caucus is a good place to look for members who care about these issues. I think Republicans have been riding very close to the White House and President Trump in the first few months of the administration to kind of figure out. Everybody knew this was going to be a different administration than the first Trump administration. They wanted to figure out what this administration looked like and where those pressure points are. And like I said, people are going to have to spend money in this space moving forward. And so we have a couple more months. We have 2 or 3 months more to ride out where kind of like the cuts and restructure take place. And moving forward from there, there's going to have to be bipartisan efforts here. They may not call it climate change. I mean, we have one client that hosts a climate science center, and they had to change their name during the first Trump administration to the Climate Adaptation Center. So there are going to be initiatives like that. But I think the caucus will probably come back together in some shape or form, even if it's under a different name.
Go ahead, Dan. Were you going to add to that? I'm sorry.
No, actually, I wasn't. But maybe just harken back to one thing that we were talking about just a little bit earlier, on the economic messaging. Maybe you know, I feel like you know, we can, when I'm talking with clients and we're talking with officials in general, you know, sometimes what gets missed is the economic message. You know, the sort of vitality, you know, of energy and climate work, you know, as a part of the broader economy. And that's true, I think, just about anywhere, regardless of political affiliation, red or blue states, however you want to color the map. There's something to like, you know, in these investments. I think the trickier part, and I know Massachusetts is right now grappling with this, is how do you pay for some of these initiatives? And so a lot of work gets put into funding streams, right? Should we be turning instead you know, from you know, putting things on ratepayers to utility bills through maybe some kind of bonding mechanism, you know, just ideas like that. Like how do we, and that makes that message a little easier to sell when we solve the funding piece of it. But otherwise, people really get that, you know, and it can cut through a lot of the reluctance, or even among, you know, Democrats who normally agree on a lot of more progressive policies. there might be reluctance sometimes if there's going to be, if there's a perception that there'll be a heavy impact on ratepayers.
Right. Yeah, I just came from a conference, a smart energy conference. It's probably a good term to be used for in this context up in the Maritimes of Canada in Nova Scotia. And I think the opportunity, obviously tariffs are impacting so many things, and certainly Canada is no exception to that. But states are starting to take a lead on potential bilateral trade. Hydropower power obviously coming down to New England, back and forth, and back up to the Maritimes as well, or Quebec. Be part of the Climate Leaders Forum in DC. Given the uncertainty what's happening now, and even you continue to see federal now intervention on state-led projects, offshore wind, obviously the Equinor project in New York yesterday. How much, and Republicans always been for free trade and so forth, but we know it's a changed world. How, this hasn't reared its head in terms of being a controversy, as much as it can be controversial, but how realistic those initiatives or opportunities, because they even put in the best light, because you can make a very positive, accurate economic narrative out of it. So going back to the trade question, it's a state and trade question. We definitely see states, the New England states are all aligned in speaking to Canadian Maritimes. Maine was there, Massachusetts, New York as well. But will Congress speak to speak the Republican side? Are they going to hold to their traditional roots of advocating for free trade and expanding trade, or will this, because it's depending on the energy narrative is crafted, be one that is where a cog is put in the middle of it?
Joe, sorry, and George and Dan may have varying opinions because we actually haven't had this conversation really internally. I really think that remains to be seen. There's a total shift in, which party is saying what in terms of free trade. We're seeing, we're working on a domestic sourcing issue for the military issue, and what used to be the Democratic initiative to keep it as pure domestic sourcing is becoming a Republican initiative, right? Because they want to keep things out of China. And I think the one area we can say for sure there's bipartisan support on the Hill, and it doesn't even matter what industry we're talking about, is reducing any imports from China and any dependence on China. And so we're seeing that across the board and expect that to be something that's bipartisan. I mean, we talk to members about it on, again, different sectors, and every single time it's do not make me take this vote on the floor, right? Like I want to have this conversation behind closed doors because I don't want to be having this conversation on the floor. Beyond that, there's so many pieces at play here. It's not just the conversation about where clean energy or climate change lands. It really depends on where the tariffs land, because that's going to change a lot of, in particular, Republican views or Republican talking points on where they stand on free trade. So my opinion is that is probably one of the most up in the air areas right now, and we'll see. This is something that members are flip-flopping on a lot right now.
Yeah, I would say that the trade issue has always been sort of, and I know we're out of time, so I'll be really quick, but
Yep.
has always sort of cleaved the parties. Going back decades, right? You have the sort of Midwest working class union-backed, Democrats who are almost all but extinct now, but the Sherrod Browns, the Gary Peters from Michigan, even the Bernie Sanders wing, right? Like they have been more protectionist in their sort of trade policies than the Obama administration was. They opposed a lot of the attempts in the Obama administration to pursue Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Republican Party has similarly kind of had its protectionist wings versus its free trade wings. They're sort of all kind of grappling with they've hitched themselves to the Trump train, and we're all protectionists now. And I think it's Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana who the other day was like, I don't really know what our position is now, but I'll follow the president whatever we do. He's a very candid individual. So I think, Lisa just mentioned this flip-flopping. Some of them aren't even being particularly, aren't really hiding the ball on that. They're just following the president's lead, and we'll see how long that goes. I think it probably depends on the polling, and it depends on the market. It depends on what they're hearing from folks in their states or their districts as well.
Well, thanks for that. I want to, as we are now at time, thank you everyone for attending. Join me in thanking our incredible panelists, Lisa Shan, George Gomes and Dan Collins and their insights. Just a reminder for folks, you can check out our website. We have incredible webinars that are being scheduled and coming up around how to communicate and around communications. We'll be sending out an email, including this video, to all attendees and the contact information of our panelists. On behalf of the Alliance for Climate Transition and Fremont Strategists, thank you very much for joining us. On behalf of ACT, thank you for what you do, all of you, to continue to grow this ecosystem. The undercurrent, the momentum of the climate economy will not be stopped. We got all the work to do, and the insights provided today will go a long way. It will give us the tools and how to help us move forward. So thank you again for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks all.